Good evening. NATO defense ministers have just held an extraordinary meeting addressing COVID-19 and NATO's response. We have done so by secure video conference. This was a timely and substantive discussion. We reviewed our response to the pandemic and we agreed on the next steps we need to take to continue to support each other and support our partners. COVID-19 represents an unprecedented challenge to our nations. It has a profound impact on our people and our economies. And it is imposing historic shocks on the international system, which could have long-term consequences. The crisis has shown that our nations are resilient and united. Our militaries are already playing a key role in support of national civilian efforts. And using NATO mechanisms, allies have been helping each other to save lives. NATO's top operational commander, General Walters, was tasked by foreign ministers 2 weeks ago to coordinate military support. And today he updated us on his efforts to ensure NATO uses its military resources most effectively. Military forces from across the alliance have flown more than 100 missions to transport medical personnel, supplies and treatment capabilities, facilitated the construction of 25 field hospitals, added more than 25,000 treatment beds, and over 4,000 military medical personnel have been deployed in support of civilian efforts. Today, I encouraged all allies to make their capabilities available so General Walters can coordinate further support. I welcome the additional offers made by ministers today. All NATO allies are affected by the pandemic, but not in the same way at the same time. So when we effectively coordinate our resources, we make a real difference. Defense ministers also addressed NATO's continued deterrence and defense. The bottom line is that security challenges have not diminished because of COVID-19. On the contrary, potential adversaries will look to exploit the situation to further their own interests. Terrorist groups could be emboldened. The security situation in Afghanistan and Iraq remains fragile, and we see a continued pace of Russian military activity. So we must maintain our deterrence and defense, because our core mission remains the same, to ensure peace and stability. While we continue to take all the necessary measures to protect our armed forces, our operational readiness remains undiminished. And our forces remain ready, vigilant and prepared to respond to any threat. We also discussed the importance of countering disinformation, both from state and non-state actors, trying to solve division in the alliance and in Europe and to undermine our democracies. We are countering these false narratives with facts and with concrete actions. We're also working even closer with allies and the European Union to identify, monitor and expose disinformation and to respond robustly. Finally, we considered the long-term implications of this health crisis for our societies and for the world around us. The geopolitical effects of the pandemic could be significant. Some may seek to use the economic downturn as an opening to invest in our critical industries and infrastructure, which in turn may affect our long-term security and our ability to deal with the next crisis when it comes. So ministers had an in-depth discussion on how we prepare for the long-term effects of COVID-19. It is too soon to draw the final conclusions, but it is clear that we must further bolster the resilience of our societies, better plan for pandemics in the future, protect our critical industries, and improve our business continuity planning. Ministers agreed a set of recommendations to strengthen our resilience by updating our existing baseline requirements for civil preparedness based on the lessons from the crisis, and by working even closer with our international partners. So it is significant that today we were also joined by the European Union, by the EU High Representative, and our close partners Finland and Sweden. Because COVID-19 is a threat to all of us, and together we can emerge stronger from this unprecedented crisis. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you, Secretary General. We now start with a question by Skype from Brooks Stigner from Jane's Defence. Brooks, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you for the time, Secretary General. Two quick questions. As you mentioned, the COVID crisis will impose huge pressure on Europe's leaders to favor probably economic spending over defense. First of all, do you think there should be a temporary respite for the Allies' pledge to reach the 2% GDP spending goal by 2024? I assume you'll say no, but should this idea at least be considered? Second question, resilience. In operational areas such as air and sea lift, satellite comms, and energy, the Allies rely heavily on expensive standby contracts with commercial suppliers. Question, do you think the Allied militaries need to start maintaining this on their own, moving away from so many commercial suppliers in order to increase their resilience? Thank you.
So first on resilience, we have agreed that, of course, we will look into the consequences for our resilience planning when we learn the lessons from this crisis. And we have initiated that work at the meeting today to look into the medium and long-term consequences, including how to further strengthen our resilience so we are prepared for the next crisis. We have in NATO developed over a long period of time baseline requirements for resilience in 7 different areas: health, mass casualties, transportation, infrastructure, telecommunications, continuity of government, and other areas. So of course, when we update these baseline requirements, we'll take into account the lessons learned from the crisis we face now. What the concrete outcome will be, I think it's a bit too early to say, but all allies have some homework to do based on what we see in this COVID-19 crisis. Let me also add that, well, of course, there are challenges and there are lessons to be learned. But I would like to highlight 2 things. One is that our immediate focus now is not to, what should I say, look into the long-term consequences. The time will come where we have to do that. Our immediate concern now is to actually address the crisis as we face it today, to help to save lives and to mobilize as much support as we can. And Sir Kerr briefed us on what NATO allies and NATO is doing, and it is significant the way the military, NATO, provides support to the civilian efforts to combat COVID-19 or the coronavirus. And I also think that actually, for instance, the airlift capabilities, the medical evacuation or the ability to transport patients, field hospitals and many other parts of our resilience has proven extremely valuable and very operational in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. So, of course, there are always things that can be improved, but I think also we have seen that NATO as a crisis alliance, or an alliance which has been prepared for crisis for decades, actually, and the military actually play a very important role in providing support to the civilian efforts dealing with the crisis. When it comes to economy and budgets, of course, there will be economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. We have seen a significant reduction in GDP. We have seen forecasts about further reductions, and of course there will be budget consequences. At the same time, I think it's a bit too early to say how big those consequences will be, because that will not least depend on how long the crisis will last. Second, what we have seen is that in investing in military capabilities is not only important to address military threats, but having military capabilities is also extremely helpful addressing a health crisis. The military provides a surge capacity, which is now proven, or which is now becoming very important, or is important for the civilian society as they combat the coronavirus. So it highlights that investing in military is not only a way to deal with military threats, but also with other threats and challenges. And I think that's a good thing, proving that the armed forces, the military, can help the civilian societies.
Jovana Jurisic from Daily Pobieda in Podgorica.
Do you have plans for sending NATO contra-hybrid teams to Western Balkan countries? I mean, Western Balkan countries who are NATO member states, to help them to cope with propaganda and disinformation in time of the pandemic? Thank you.
There has been no request for NATO sending counter-hybrid teams. We have done that before to Montenegro, but there has been no request for doing this now. And actually, I think that the most important thing NATO can do is to send concrete support. And countries in the Western Balkans have received support from NATO and NATO allies, especially North Macedonia highlighted that very much during the meeting. This was the first meeting, first ministerial meeting where a defense minister from North Macedonia participated, and Minister Radmila Sekerinska listed how many NATO allies, the Netherlands, the United States, the Czech Republic, Norway, and many other NATO allies have provided concrete support with medical equipment, field hospital, financial support, and so on to North Macedonia, and I think that's the best way, both to provide concrete support to allies as NATO and NATO allies do every day, but it's also the best way to counter any attempt to conduct disinformation campaigns, because by acting we send a clear message. So we provide support to our allies in the Western Balkans, but today we also discussed with our Supreme Operational Commander General Walters how we can speed up and step up the support.
Thank you. We'll now go to Terry Schultz from Deutsche Welle NPR.
Mr. Secretary General, you mentioned this just briefly in your introduction, but already before COVID hit, there were concerns that China in particular was buying up important military assets throughout Europe. Now that companies and countries are going to be suffering serious economic consequences, and some of these assets, some of the owners of these assets may need to sell, is it really too early to start reminding of the message that they need to keep important assets that could be useful for NATO in national hands? And also, did anyone bring up around the table, especially with Josep Borrell there, concerns about the U.S. cutoff of funding for the WHO? There have been comments about this on the EU side, and I wondered what your thoughts were on that, or if any allies expressed concerns about that. Thanks.
We had an in-depth discussion about the medium and long-term effects, including on our resilience, and many allies highlighted the importance of critical industries, infrastructure as part of our resilience. And resilience is a NATO responsibility. It's enshrined in our founding treaty in Article 3. So reliable infrastructure, reliable telecommunications, governments which can function also in times of crisis, all these issues are of great importance for the civilian society, but also for our military readiness and preparedness. So this is very much interlinked. I'm not saying that it's too early to remind allies on the importance of focus on this and making sure that we have resilient critical infrastructure, industries, and that we are able to, for instance, provide critical equipment during crisis as we see today. Actually, that's something which we have already addressed, and I highlighted that also in the meeting today. And the fact that we will now most likely have an economic downturn may make some allies more vulnerable for situations where critical infrastructure can be sold out. And that can undermine our resilience. So I convey that message, but also many allies convey that message during the meeting. So no, it's not any way too early to highlight or to underline that message. What I said was a bit too early was to draw the final conclusion about what will be the outcome from our next update review of the resilience guidelines, because that will not necessarily take some time. And our focus now is on saving lives and addressing the concrete consequences of the current crisis we are faced with. The WHO is an intergovernmental organization. NATO is not a member of that organization, but NATO has used guidelines from the WHO to implement preventive measures in NATO missions and operations here at the NATO headquarters, NATO command structure, and I believe in the importance of international cooperation and transparency, and of course, since we are not a member, we will not assess how the organization is working, but we have used the guidelines provided by WHO to implement preventive measures in NATO.
Thank you. We can now go to Kabul and Khashnoud Nabizada from Hama Press.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I have now a question for you on Afghanistan. How will the recent political developments and the US Taliban peace deal affect NATO mission in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Well, NATO allies and NATO have expressed support to the agreement between the US and Taliban. And to support the peace efforts, we have decided to adjust our troop levels in Afghanistan from currently roughly 16,000 down to 12,000. But we have also said that any reduction will be conditions-based, and that we remain committed to Afghanistan, and that we will continue to provide training, assistance, and also financial support. And we have to understand that even at the level of 12,000, we will be able to continue the mission operations very much as we have done for several years now, because we were actually almost at that level until 2017. Then we had an increase to 16,000. Now we are back again almost at the same level we had before the increase in 2017. So the NATO troop levels have been has been adjusted before, up and down, and we has conveyed the clear message that what we do in Afghanistan will be conditions-based. So NATO's message is that we went into Afghanistan together. We'll make the decisions on adjusting our postures together. And when the time is right, we'll of course leave together, but we will leave when the conditions are in place for reducing further our presence. We actually believe that the best way we can support the peace efforts is to continue to support the Afghan security forces by doing that, sending a message to Taliban that they will not win on the battlefield. They have to sit down and make real compromises on the negotiating table. We call on Taliban to respect the peace or the agreement with the US, to reduce violence and to sit down and engage in inter-Afghan negotiations. It is also important that the political challenges we see on the government side and in Afghanistan, that they are addressed, and we need unity. We need a functioning political process in Afghanistan, not least to be able to fully engage in the peace process.